Now today on the official Star Wars website, we had several new upcoming books announced, and if you want to learn more about all of them, I'll put a link to the announcement in the description below, because in this video I'm only going to be talking about one of them, that being the novel called Shadow of the Sith, which will be set 20 years after Return of the Jedi, or 10 years then before the sequel trilogy. Which, not that you have to love or even really care about the new canon or the sequels, it is an interesting time period in regards to them because we know very, very little about the sort of final years leading up to the sequels, with the book Bloodline, which is set 6 years before the sequel trilogy begins, being one of the very few stories of any kind that delves into the time period at all. And one thing that's interesting about that book, and will be relevant to the discussion about this new one coming out next June, which again is called Shadow of the Sith, is that in it Ben Solo is still with and training under Luke Skywalker at that time, meaning that despite how it might be sort of portrayed in the films, Luke has not been gone or self-exiled on Ahch-To for years upon years or for a very, very long time, like it kind of feels like in the films. Instead, at most, he's been gone for 6 years. And in that book, in Bloodline, which mainly deals with Leia and the politics of the time, all we know about Luke and Ben is that they are away and up to or looking for something. It never really gets touched on or explained in the book. Furthermore, in this book, when the galaxy learns that Leia is actually the daughter of Darth Vader, which is the big sort of moment or reveal, she sends a message to her son, to Ben, telling him this information, telling him who his grandfather is since it's been kept from him his whole life, which at the time the book came out, which was shortly before The Last Jedi, it left many speculating that learning of this would have something to do with his turn to the dark side. But anyway, this new book, Shadow of the Sith, again takes place 10 years before the sequels, or 4 years before Bloodline then. As for what it's going to be about, well, I'll put the whole synopsis that we were given on screen should you want to pause the video and read it, but I'll just try to give you a brief synopsis of the synopsis, which is that Luke is having visions of a dark side force or power rising somewhere out in space on a planet called Exegol. Meanwhile, Lando had his daughter, who is of course Jannah from The Rise of Skywalker. He had her kidnapped, and while searching for her, he learns of a Sith assassin called Ochi, who has been given a blade, the one we see in the movie, and is tasked with finding and capturing Rey, which of course we also see in Episode 9. Lando and Luke then go searching for Ochi, for this Sith assassin, and they search for answers as to what this dark side power could be, or how to get to Exegol. And that's the general story of the book, it seems. And at face value, that might sound all fine and dandy. Sounds like we're going to have the dagger, the Wayfinder devices, Ochi, why Lando and Luke went looking for Exegol in the first place, and all of that explained. And there's no doubt that the movie, that The Rise of Skywalker, didn't really do, well, any of that. It didn't explain any of those things, or explain much at all considering the blistering pace of that film. Basically, all we knew about any of that was from Lando, who said that he and Luke were tracking Ochi and searching for a Wayfinder device to get to Exegol, and why they actually wanted to get there or know its location is completely unknown. It wasn't explained, though we can maybe assume that Luke had heard or read of Exegol and just wanted to know where it is, because it's a good thing to know where an important Sith world is. But now, from the synopsis of the book, we learned it's much, much more than that. We learned that Luke has been sensing a rising dark side power coming from somewhere out in space 10 years before the sequel trilogy begins, which brings up all sorts of rather interesting questions that let's get into, mainly for the fun of it and because I enjoy this sort of thing. And granted here, I obviously haven't read the book yet. I will when it comes out. And I'm trying to make sense of something that was never planned out or given much thought originally or when the films were being made, and that they're now trying to go back to patch together after the fact in order for the sequels to make more sense. And so anyway, the first question we have to ask is, if Luke Skywalker knew or strongly suspected that the Sith had returned, and the synopsis even says Lando tells him it's the Sith, then at what point did he, stop looking for the Sith and for Exegol if he knew that it was the source of some rising dark side threat he was sensing? The Rise of Skywalker then sort of implies that Lando and Luke hit a dead end on Pasaana and that they just gave up the search then and there. Yet we can maybe assume that in the book Bloodline, where again Luke and Ben are gone with no real explanation as to what they're doing. Even Leia doesn't seem to know where they are or what they're doing. We can maybe assume those two, Ben and Luke, were still looking for exile together at that point. That sounds like a logical conclusion, right? I mean, I can't believe at some point Luke, who is being haunted by visions of a growing dark side power, as the book Synopsis says, and where he and Lando are on the trail of a Sith assassin, I can't believe he'd ever just say, nah, we're not going to worry about that anymore, and we're going to stop looking for it, and let's now, me and you, Ben, go on a road trip and do something else altogether, not worrying about where the Sith might be exerting their influence in the galaxy as the New Republic struggles to overcome some internal conflicts and differences, as seen in the book Bloodline. The even bigger question this then leads to, and the biggest sort of mystery of all when it comes to the sequel trilogy era or trying to build solid and intriguing context around it, which is no easy task, is how do we get back to Luke at his training temple for that fateful night when he goes into Ben's hut, senses the dark side in him, and briefly contemplates striking him down. How does that even come about when you really stop and think about it? I mean, first of all, that night has to take place years after Luke has now learned of a growing and haunting dark side presence or power somewhere out in the galaxy, one we can even assume that he's taken Ben along with in search of. Not to mention, Ben really shouldn't be his student anymore, should he? One would think he'd be a full-fledged Jedi at this time, considering he's around the age of 24, and as learned elsewhere in the canon, he's been training since around the age of 9. I think 15 years and being 24 is about time to be knighted as a Jedi. But anyway, disregarding that for now and just going back to the incident, as I call it, even before we learn that Luke had been, for years, sensing a dark side power, I've argued the whole encounter is strange considering Luke's reasoning for looking into Ben's mind in the first place that night was he suspected he'd find darkness there. Meaning he should have been prepared for it, to find something horrible, which is why he's looking in the first place, and that maybe he should have left his lightsaber back in his hut. You know, the whole Yoda thing about your weapons, you will not need them. To say nothing of the fact that he once upon a time tossed his lightsaber away in the face of Palpatine, the greatest evil the galaxy has perhaps ever known. So anyway, it's already odd that Luke would go into Ben's hut in the middle of the night looking for the dark side and then freak out when he finds it when he suspected he would find it. But now we know Luke has been sensing some horrible dark side threat for years at this point. In other words, he knows the Sith are back. He also knows that Ben has recently learned his grandfather was Darth Vader. And yet, with all of that in mind, he goes and looks into Ben's head and sees darkness and has that moment where he contemplates striking him down. And then after that, he decides to give up on everything and exile himself and do absolutely nothing about it. I mean, it was kind of hard enough to swallow all of that without context, nearly impossible really. But now that we're given context, and again, haven't read it yet, but it seems like Luke knew of the dark side's return and of its growing power, was or had been actively looking for it for years in order to stop it presumably, but when he found his biggest sort of clue, and that it was inside his nephew that he'd been training for years at this point, he gave up and decided to do nothing about any of it because he made one single mistake. Does that really make sense? However, if I had to guess here or speculate about what this story will try and do or be about, and if I were a betting man, I would absolutely put my money on it's going to be implied that this dark side presence or power that Luke had been sensing for years had corrupted his mind, that it, or Palpatine, was responsible for his reaction that fateful night, a reaction that sent Ben Solo to the dark side and into the hands of Snoke that was being, of course, puppet mastered by Palpatine himself. And furthermore, it was this corruption of Luke's mind that not only made him give up on the Jedi, but that kept him from doing anything about it and instead sent him into hiding, and why Snoke wanted to find Luke, because he knew eventually Luke might get over this corruption and come out of hiding and save the day. And that what ultimately caused that to happen, or that slowly started to bring him about, is Rey coming to the island and sort of breaking the curse, if you will. There was even a comic book a couple years back that implied this very thing could or would happen to Luke when, after the events of The Empire Strikes Back, Palpatine essentially reached out through the Force and almost got Luke to give up on everything, but ultimately failed. Now, assuming I'm right and this is roughly how the book will play out, you're of course free to love this idea, hate it, or not care at all. That's up to you. But I don't find it surprising at all that the first sort of foray into the sequel trilogy era in some time, or something bordering on it and heavily involving it technically, outside of the third volume of the Vader comics, which dealt with exile quite a bit. Anyway, it's not surprising at all that it's going to try and repair Luke Skywalker from the sequels. I think the season 2 finale of The Mandalorian showed Disney and Lucasfilm, not that they shouldn't have known it beforehand, but it really showed them all the potential they had with Luke Skywalker, especially by now giving him a student like Grogu, the most popular and beloved thing to come out of the Disney era of Star Wars, and that they want to capitalize off of that as much as they possibly can, but they realize how many people don't or won't care because they know where Luke ultimately ends up, and so they of course want to fix that. Not to mention if there is any hope of ever turning some fans around when it comes to the sequels, and we can debate if there is or isn't a chance. I even made a video on this topic not long ago. It starts with Luke Skywalker. It starts with trying to explain that incident in a way that truly makes sense, if possible. Not that there isn't a bunch of other stuff in the sequels that needs help as well, but Luke is the big one and the place you start. And so again, I'm not going to be surprised at all when this book tries to completely recontextualize The Last Jedi and what was done with Luke Skywalker in it, that it was the influence of the dark side somehow that made him do it. And about the same time next summer when this book comes out, I won't be surprised or stunned when we get the announcement that a new series is coming to Disney+, one that will deal with Luke starting his Jedi Order, and that will of course include Grogu as well. The other thing this book will apparently try to do is make sense of arguably one of the dumber aspects of the rise of Skywalker, that being the Sith knife and how it worked and the story behind it, or how it lines up perfectly with the ruins of the Death Star and leads to the Wayfinder device and all of that. I mean, in reality, it was just a silly and elaborate way to hide a MacGuffin in a story, but in terms of Star Wars or in-universe, it just, well, it's pretty stupid to be blunt. And it's making it sound like, or the synopsis is, like it's all going to have something to do with a test or trial for Ochi, and I really and truly wish them good luck trying to make sense of all that, and I am genuinely curious to read the explanations on that one. As for how fans will react to any or all of this, I honestly don't know. This book, again, assuming I'm right, and I'm pretty sure I will likely be the closest thing Disney and Lucasfilm ever give us in terms of an admission of we screwed up with Luke in the sequels. Which, as I always say, doesn't mean you can't like those films or what was done with Luke in them, but from the business standpoint, and it's all about money when it comes to Disney, when you take arguably the most beloved character in your franchise and you do something with him where he becomes the reason people start to hate your franchise, again, from a business standpoint, you've screwed up and you need to make things right. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think about this upcoming book and the possibility of them trying to quote-unquote fix Luke Skywalker. Could you or would you ever begin to accept it? Do you not care anymore? Or maybe you like it as is and don't want to see it changed or recontextualized. Whatever the case may be, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.